Welcome back to the X-Brad TC podcast. Today, it's your host, X-Brad, and Jason. What are we going to talk about today, Jason? I think we're going to talk about the initial operational capability of the F-35 and the recent assessment of it by John Venable in, I want to say, heritage.org.
Yep. I guess start with, as I say, along the spectrum of pro or anti-F-35 media, the Heritage does, with understanding, fall pretty solidly on the F-35, pro F-35 side. It's a good, but I think despite that, the article does provide a good balanced view of some of the operational reasons why the F-35 is a good platform.
Yeah, and it's not like John Venable is somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, he's a former F-16 driver.
Right.
For those that don't know or didn't see the post on the blog, on August 2nd, the Air Force declared the 34th Fighter Squadron of Hill Air Force Base, part of the 388th Fighter Wing, as initially operational capable. Basically, they have 15 aircraft and sufficient pilots for initial operations. And clearance to deliver some but not all of the future weapons that the F-35A will operate.
Right.
So the Marines have declared IOC for the B model, and the Air Force has declared IOC for the A model. And I think next year is the timeline for the Navy's carrier-capable C model. Right.
Right, and I believe the current software outfit does allow for the F-35 with that fighter wing in the Air Force to deploy the M9X and the small diameter bomb. So I think for now that's going to be kind of the standard loadout. I guess the point behind the IOC is to at least allow combatant commanders that make them aware that they have the option to deploy the aircraft if they need to.
Right, and I think the Chief of the Air Combat Command said it would probably be 2017 before we see a deployment anywhere for the 34th Fighter Squadron. One thing they did just before the IOC declaration was they had a mini surge from Hill Air Force Base. They did a deployment of, I want to say, half a dozen jets up to Mountain Home Air Force Base, just so they could learn what are the problems in deploying an F-35. We've never done it, so we're going to learn by doing it. And apparently it was a very successful deployment.
Yeah. I think it's going to previously, it's going to be different fundamentally from previous fighter generations, and they talk about it a little bit in the article. But it's not just a fighter, right? I mean, look at the manner in which the F-22 is deployed in operations over Syria. They're not just using it as a kinetic asset. It's a ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platform. I think that's one, and the article does touch on, the F-35 is, I would almost say, primarily that's its role. It's an ISR platform that has a performance of a fighter. I think that's a good way to look at it. So I would imagine that when it's deployed, it's going to be for, not just for the kinetic kind of missions, but also for intelligence gathering and those kinds of missions as well.
Sure, and I think what we're going to see, one of the problems that F-35 deployments is going to create is the problem of you have so much information, so much data, that it's going to be a challenge for them to learn how to separate the wheat from the chaff.
Right.
What is the intelligence I really need? I have all this information. What's the one bit that I actually need? And that's something the services have been learning with the F-22, and also with the tons of data that they get from, Predator and Reaper operations. They see so much, it takes a while to figure out what they want to find.
Well, I think they've also learned in the F-22 deployment is there's, like you said, there's so much information generated there that you run into, essentially a data problem, right? You have all this voluminous amounts of data being generated. How do you communicate it to a fourth, fifth generation platform? B, how do you, what's your bandwidth that you need to get that information transmitted? And I know on the F-15 side, they employ that talent hate pod to be able to, to be able to enable the F-15 to talk to the S-12.
And I think that's going to be something of an embedded technology with the F-35.
Yep.
Well, one of the things we always hear about is the cost of the F-35. And to be honest, it's extraordinarily expensive program. But everybody goes, oh, it's $1 trillion to buy the airplane. Well, no, it's $1 trillion over the life cycle of the airframe, over the entire fleet of aircraft. All right, and we're talking about a minimum of 30 years of service and quite possibly 50 years of service. So $1 trillion stretched out over that is a little bit more reasonable.
Right, and I think a lot.
Venable talks about the flyaway price coming down once they reach full production, coming all the way down to about $85 million an airframe, which is pretty astonishing. I mean, that I'm guessing doesn't actually include a lot of the R&D costs, which are a sunk cost anyway, but just the production cost. When you consider that what's an F-16 run these days, 60 million?
Yep, just about 60 million, I think, for what's the latest, the Block 50s, maybe.
So, yeah, you're getting a lot more airplane for not a lot more money.
Right. You're getting that capability over the previous generation is so huge, and you're getting it at a great cost.
And the other big thing everybody talks about is that, the F-35 can't dogfight.
Yeah.
Now, you know a little bit more about EM maneuver than I do. I understand the basics, but Venable in this paper, and I'm going to link this in the show notes, and I highly suggest everyone read it. It's a long read, but it's very interesting. Venable suggests that of the 31 tactical aviators they interviewed, almost all of them would prefer to go into the fight in an F-35.
Yep.
And we're talking about people that flew the F-15, the Strike Eagle version of the F-15, F-16, A-10, and they're all very happy with the air-to-air performance, both long-range and short-range fights of the F-35.
Yep. I think it's even more telling it's F-15C guys, too, that are very happy with even the DVR performance and the BFM performance of the F-35.
Yeah. And it kind of goes into the, he doesn't really compare it, but the F-22 fight philosophy is see first, shoot first, kill first. Your sensors allow you to find them first. Your energy allows you to launch further out before you're even detected. And once they're dead, well, obviously the fight's over. You don't have to get into a turning dog fight. And apparently the 31 aviators they interviewed were very much impressed with the F-35's ability to fight that way.
Yeah, and even with the F-35 will be armed with the latest block of the AIM-9X. I think it's the Block 3, but that gets you, essentially that block of AIM-9X is a DVR weapon out to 10 miles. So, I mean, even that's kind of game changing in terms of, are you even going to get visual? And that's, I guess, that's the option that the Air Force weighed when they decided to, not put a gun on the aircraft, which, in my mind always is kind of, and at first I was in school and thought, well, like, I don't like that, but I mean, when was the last gun kill that any fighter had air to air?
Well,
the
A model does have a built-in gun.
Oh, okay.
But you only get 200 rounds, so you get
I'm thinking of
two good bursts. And it's interesting. They went with a 25 millimeter gun instead of the classic M61 20 millimeter cannon.
Yeah.
So, but still, like you say, with the AIM-9X, it's even the close-in dogfighting missile shoots it beyond visual range. And I think we also have to recognize the threat has that capability too. All right, the AA-11 Archer and various other short-range missiles with the high off-bore sight capability and a range of around 10 miles. It's going to be very, very, very dangerous for anyone to get into a visual turn-in fight.
Right. I mean, I don't want to say that, we're obviously we're talking, they talked in previous generations about the era of the dogfight being over, but, those fighters are built for that. These fighters, we don't expect a BFM fight, but if they can get into it, those fighters are built to be able to do it.
Right. And, of course, the other thing here is the F-35 isn't a fighter. It's a bomber that just happens to be pretty good at fighting airplanes. And for those who are listening and aren't really into the history of the F-35 and its variations and all this, that, and the other, it has two kind of prime strike missions and two kind of configurations for that. What they call the first day of the war, when the enemy's air defense network of radars, missiles, communication links, guns, what have you, is up and running, the F-35 will carry all of its weapons and fuel internally. And that gives it a very respectable, stealthy aspect. And so it's better able to penetrate the enemy air defense network and attack that same network. Once the enemy's air defense network has been degraded sufficiently, and the need for stealth isn't nearly as great, or if we were operating in a relatively low-threat environment, like, say, over Syria and Iraq, like we're doing now, you would have the option to hang a lot of ordnance outside the aircraft. Lots of extra bombs, lots of extra fuel, and it carries an amazing amount of ordnance for a plane this size. So when you look at today's fighter, an F-16, it has to carry everything outside anyway, whereas the F-35 at least has the option of carrying internally, at least in the early part of the war.
No, that's important to talk, it's kind of peripherally to what you're saying, because you're exactly right about day one stealth. And, it's not just kinetically destroying the air defenses, obviously, but it's also about, operating in a electronic environment that's going to be, also suppressing the defenses to an extent. So.
Oh yeah, I mean, we talk about the F-35, but the American way of war, it's not one platform doing everything. It's we're going to have the F-35s doing both kinetic strikes and doing that ISR capability that you talk about. You'll have EA-18Gs jamming. You'll have AWACS providing control and coordination and developing their own operating picture. And other electronic warfare and air defense suppression and assets working. So we can put a system of systems to work rather than just relying on one airframe to do everything.
Well, I think that's a valid rebuttal to bring up against people that don't, they don't like the F-35. They think it's a bad platform. But you ask them is to talk about when was the last time that any single, U.S. asset went to war by itself. There's a whole range of capabilities that are brought along with, just other than just deploying a fighter aircraft.
Right. I mean, we're seeing B-1 bombers used very successfully in a close air support role. I mean, it's the limiting factor isn't the airframe itself. It's how do we decide we want to use this? What is our imagination capable of? And the other thing, I think we're going to see more and more, even with semi-stealthy platforms like the F-35. You're going to see a lot of emphasis shifting from the airframe to the actual weapons. We're going to see more and more standoff weapons used for ready for high near-peer competitor warfare.
Yeah, and that also kind of brings us head on into the whole close air support argument of the F-35. I mean, I don't recall the numbers, but they brought out our A-10 pilots happy with the F-35 in terms of close air support capability, and it's kind of they may or may not be, but the point is they don't fly close air support. You don't fly close air support in an F-35 like you fly close air support in an A-10. The same kind of argument we make about air-to-air combat. You don't fly it like the previous generations.
Close air support is a mission, not a platform.
Right. I love
the A-10. I have to. It's the law. But for all the talk about the gun. Yeah, the gun doesn't get used much.
Right.
They tend to use, and the Air Force spent a lot of money to add the capability for A-10s to drop JDAMs, the GPS guided joint direct attack munition. That's the preferred weapon for close air support.
No, that's a good point you bring up about the B-1s and B-52s being used in the CAS role. I mean, if people are happy with that, then what's wrong with the, I mean, I hate to break it down and make it that simple, but effectively that's how an F-35 is going to fly a close air support mission.
Oh, sure. They're going to fly it.
I mean, it's going to be right.
Presuming a low threat environment, they're just going to cruise around at medium altitude, work with the JTACs, the terminal attack controllers, and use guided weapons to hit pinpoint targets. Right. That's what has been going on in Afghanistan and Iraq since 2001.
Right.
And
there haven't been rumblings of, I know primarily the criticism about CAS in Iraq and Afghanistan has been the rules of engagement and not the manner in which CAS is provided.
Yes. And the other thing is, if we do have to fight in a contested environment, the A-10 is in trouble.
Right.
They took very serious losses in Desert Storm. Not terrible, not as bad as like the tornado community did, but they took a lot of losses. And that was against relatively ancient short-range air defense systems.
Mm-hmm.
And people will say, but look at this plane that came back all shot up. Well, yeah, it got shot up. That's the point. Whereas a fast, maneuverable, and standoff attack that still puts the bombs on the target wouldn't have taken the hit. I mean, the F-15E Strike Eagle was out there doing the same mission as the A-10, and they weren't getting shot down.
Right. I don't think we're in that environment where we can say, nobody's gonna risk a pilot like that anymore. We're not as that's a propaganda victory essentially for the enemy.
Yeah,
and we're not going to put crews at risk.
I think the Army's become entirely too dependent on close air support because they've had such easy access to it.
Right.
I mean, people like to knock the Air Force. They don't like to do CAS. Well, they've been doing a metric ton of it for the last decade and a half. That's all they've done. I mean, they've had their entire fleet of every attack-capable aircraft cycling in and out of Iraq and Afghanistan to support grunts on the ground, right? And I've never heard anybody say that, no, I don't want Air Force to drop the bombs. I'd rather wait and get somebody else. No, everybody takes it. Which, ironically, if you look back at the Army's airland battle doctrine, the doctrine through the 80s, the Army carefully kind of actually eschewed what we think of close air support. The Air Force and the Army had an agreement that if it was within artillery range, it was an Army problem.
Mm-hmm.
Exceptions would be made, but if the Army could shoot it, the Army would shoot it. And that would allow the Air Force to concentrate deeper into the enemy's backfield, hitting more remunerative targets, if you will.
Yeah.
But now we've gotten to the point where one guy holed up in a mud hut gets a half dozen JDAMs from a $80 million F-15.
Well, part of my understanding in the air-land battle was also that, if you had to task an Air Force, if you had to do an Air Force tasking in an Army, battle or whatever you call it, that their tasking was going to be to target air defense vehicles for, the VSU-23-4, some of the tactical SAM platforms. That would be an ideal A-10 target, and then once those are eliminated, then they'd send in the Apaches to go after the actual armor.
Well, that's the the old what's called the JAT, Joint Army Air Tactic, where A-10s and Cobras or Apaches would cooperate, and one would suppress the air defense, and the other would do the actual strike. And either way, it could go either way. You could have the Apaches suppressing the air defense, and the A-10s going for the tanks, or vice versa. But what the Army was looking at was, under air-land battle, was, let's say my division is engaged with 3 Soviet divisions. Well, the Soviets do what they call the echelon attack. So I'm only fighting 1 division at a time. The other 2 are backed up behind the lead division. I can pretty easily handle 1 division. The problem is I won't have time to reset before the 2nd and 3rd divisions come in and hit me. Well, while I'm handling the 1st division, the 2nd division is all bunched up, getting ready to attack. That's a beautiful target for the Air Force. And that's how air-land would try to integrate air operations in with land operations. And to go back to that scenario, while taking on the 1st division, the 3rd division is across a river, and the Air Force can go drop the bridges and delay that division. So I do have time to reset.
And those essentially become area targets for not those. I think that's what they termed interdiction, like longer range interdiction outside of the forward edge of the battle area.
Right. There was what they call battlefield air interdiction, which was going after temporarily halted targets, units, formations, rather than just infrastructure, but also tied into the ground commander's plan. They didn't just get to bomb whatever they wanted. They would bomb what and when the commander needed to bomb. But we're kind of straying away from the F-35 here a little bit. But the operations kind of drive how we decide to buy airplanes. And if we're going to operate and use the Air Force to do that battlefield air interdiction, they're going to have to be able to operate in a contested environment against air defense systems. And I don't think that's something that the A-10 can do in the era where there's just so many short-range surface-to-air missiles.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, the F-35 is really the only platform that can do anything in a contested environment with the double-digit SAM systems. There's no other platform, even if you rely a little bit on electronic warfare and that kind of thing. The F-35 is really the only thing that can accomplish its mission in that kind of threat environment.
All right. Let's move on. You saw that article about the Navy's carriers going to be obsolete. Mm-hmm. I know you saw it at War is Boring, but it was actually I don't even know how to pronounce his name. Dave Majumdar. He first published it in nationalinterest.org, and our friend Brian McGrath was actually quoted in the article. And let me read this little brief bit about Brian McGrath's quote. And the argument is that the modern big deck aircraft carrier is obsolete. Brian McGrath, managing director of naval consultancy Ferry Bridge Group, agreed with Hendricks. The case for the carrier will suffer if the Navy drags its feet on what comes next in the air wing, he told the National Interest, also advocating for the development of new carrier-based long-range unmanned strike aircraft. Quote, Always remember, the carrier doesn't care what it launches and recovers. It's just a floating airport. The air wing is the key. Get the air wing wrong, or continue to, and yes, the CVN nuclear carrier investment makes less sense. End quote. That's true. And it's also a mistake that was made 30 years ago. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I do agree, and I think that kind of points to something that, the Navy, we've had the discussion before with Brian about, the Navy really doesn't have a long-range strike platform. Now, I think there's an argument to be said that, do you alleviate that a little bit by employing weapons that you can stand off to that range to? I mean, yes and no. But I think there really is, the Navy's, obviously looking at an unmanned long-range strike platform, and I don't even think the Navy's sure about what the Navy defines as long range.
Well,
I think that discussion still has to get resolved.
I think there's still a few people in the fleet, or people like Brian, who are old enough to remember, the days of the 1,000-mile A6 F-14 strikes, where they could literally reach out to a target 1,000 miles away and blow it up, only supported by the assets of the air wing.
Right.
Yeah, you're not going to do that with an F-18 equipped air wing.
Right. Not even the Super Hornets can go out to that range. Ordnance.
But I think when we see the C model F-35 come into the fleet, it's going to help that a little bit. Not a lot, but I was amazed. The F-35 has this, stupendous internal fuel load. I mean, it was like more than an A6 could carry.
Right.
Yeah, you're going to get some good long-range capability out of the F-35 eventually.
And I think even in addition to the fuel capacity, I think the other side of the equation, it's a low drag airframe, right? Because you're not really day one, you're not carrying weapons externally, right? So you have all that fuel and you have all the weapons without all that drag.
Much higher cruise speed than an A6, which, let's face it, with weapons, you've got about 350 knots cruise speed. So you're going to see some capability. I mean, put out a super to top him off halfway to the target, and put out another to, do the recovery tanking. You're going to see some long-range capability with the F-35.
Yep.
Brian also argues in that article that we should probably develop a couple of organic platforms, particularly an organic tanker. And yes, I would really like to see that. It always just drives me crazy watching an F-18 fueling somebody else.
Well, I mean, there's reasons that it should drive you crazy, in that really weird nexus of economics and military things. You're burning hours on an airframe doing, an unmanned airframe doing what? Drilling holes in the sky, reeling out a tanker hose, which isn't the most efficient use of a strike fighter asset, obviously. So there are some missions that I think you can get away with an unmanned. I don't think that the unmanned tanker is going to be just a tanker. To be frank with you, I think there's going to be other roles that they're going to be able to find that they can do with it. They're probably going to be able to do, maybe some maritime, S3 kind of capabilities to it. They're probably going to, they're probably going to do some, some maritime ISR, maybe some land if they want to, risk it over land, and I think there'll be different bolt-on roles that they'll be able to do in addition to the tanker. But
so
the
ISR part. Do maritime surveillance. If you're going to have the tanker overhead of the strike group, might as well have it serving, as a radar platform, and then as a network node too for the data links.
Right. And the other thing is, well, that's interesting you say that too, because our current, our KC-135 fleet, one of the little-known roles for that is also a communications link, a data link, in addition to just the tanker. But we have the strike fighter shortfall, and everybody's concerned about burning hours in F-18s, and this is, it's just a horribly inefficient way to use hours in an airframe, a manned airframe.
It is. And the only bright side is these hours we're burning over Afghanistan and Iraq. They're flying, really long missions. So for all the hours that you're burning, you're not getting quite as many land hits, which tends to be
right.
Stress on the airframe. But,
yeah,
it makes no sense.
One of the stronger arguments, and I don't know if that made a mention in the article, that Brian's always made, is that if you can see that our carriers are vulnerable to things like DF-21D and all that kind of thing, is you have to say that our land bases are even more vulnerable. At least our supposedly vulnerable aircraft carrier is a land base, quote unquote, that can move. Guam can't move. Japan can't move.
To tip over.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah.
So I think,
like you say, if you can hit a carrier with a DF-21, you can hit a land base.
Yeah, and it's harder to find a carrier than it's harder to find an island, So I think that argument is a non sequitur as far as the carrier being vulnerable.
I think the Navy needs to go back to demonstrating to itself its ability to hide a carrier.
Yeah.
And what was it? Exercise Northern Wedding in 1982, 83. The U.S. Navy sent 2 carrier battle groups up into the northern Pacific, and they promptly disappeared. The Russians simply could not find them, and they spent their time doing practice missions, absolutely no electronic emissions. They were, invisible to everybody. They would dodge the Soviet reconnaissance satellites, and nobody knew where they were, until they decided they wanted the Soviets to know where they were. And they popped up right off the Russian coast and scared the absolute crap out of them. Mm-hmm. And that's something the Navy needs to go back to being able to do.
Yeah, I think they did that similar thing during the Taiwan crisis back in I think it was '96, and they sent 2 carriers through the Taiwan Strait there, and I don't know how hard it was to either find or not find those ships, but I mean that's another example that you're exactly right. The Navy should be, not only do you get a good training opportunity, you're kind of sending a message to the Chinese, being a little bit more aggressive in terms of exercising FONOPs.
We talk about the stunning success in Desert Storm was an impetus for the Chinese, who studied it very closely, to begin their anti-access area denial strategy. But I think the 96 Taiwan Straits incident was what really kicked it into high gear. Out of nowhere, 2 carriers popped up, sailed through the Taiwan Straits, being loud and obnoxious, reminding China that there wasn't really anything they could do about it. And then
the only thing the Chinese did in response was to move a couple S-300 batteries closer to the coast.
Yeah, but wasn't much they could do to stop us. And they kind of decided they don't want to be in that position again.
Right. Well, I don't think, following the Desert Storm example, we're sure not going to have the opportunity to do a slow force buildup. Well, not, slow in terms of, 6 months, but obviously more intricate than that. But, we're not going to have that opportunity to do that again.
Probably not. The great strength of the carrier is its mobility. And with that mobility is the initiative. The carrier gets to decide at the time and place where it wants to strike. All right? Right. It allows you to focus power at the objective. And generally, you should be able to achieve an overmatch against a localized objective. For instance, the Chinese are building up these islands in the South China Sea. They are going to be a serious pain in the butt. But if it was a shooting war, those would simply be targets. They would not be assets. They would be liabilities.
Right.
You could drive a carrier in, obliterate it, drive back out. And interestingly, I'm reading about the USS Enterprise CV-6 in World War II, and this is exactly the part of the book I'm in, is the first raids after Pearl Harbor. The Enterprise, the Lexington, a couple other carriers would go hit Kwajalein, Marcus, Wake Island. They pounded Wake Island. And they would drive in, establish local air superiority for the length of time that they needed to, and then just drive away. And the Japanese couldn't find them. So we've covered carriers, we've covered the F-35. What else would you like to go over today?
I can't think of anything.
Of the X-Brad TC podcast. We will catch you later. On behalf of Jason and myself, have a good day. Bye.
Thanks, guys.